the Great Commission using our gifts and to build the body of Christ. So it's a great opportunity, and I'm grateful that God has given it to us. But what I wanted to talk about today, if you notice from the verses that were read and the video that we saw, was the idea of living water. So we're going to be reading the passage of the woman at the well. If you were here for Bible studies on Wednesdays, we had just gone over that. So may seem redundant, but I'm going to hit on a different thing that God specifically spoke to me when I was hearing at that Bible study, because it's a different take on it, and it's a different part of it. So it's really just a couple verses, but I'm going to read the whole passage so we can get the feel, because it really helps, because there's just something that God really spoke. So before we open the word, let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this day and for another chance to come and to hear your word. And I pray that you would just speak and let no flesh be seen, and just the only thing seen would be you, and that no one else would be lifted up, no one else would be seen as good, but you would be seen as good, and you would teach us and speak to us, and ultimately we would come home and go home today as people who understand that you're the living water. And I pray that you would just speak to us in Jesus' name, amen. So if you would like, open your Bibles to John chapter 4. We will be starting in verse 1. So we are going to be reading quite a few verses, so you'll have to bear with it, but it helps really lay the backdrop of the story. So it's necessary, but I think it's always good to kind of get all of it. So we'll start at verse 1, only going to be touching on a portion of it, but we'll read all of it. So here we go. John 4, verse 1. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." And then starting at verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." Just then his disciples came back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman. But no one said, "What do you seek?" or why are you talking with her?" So the woman left her water jar and went away into town and said to the people, Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" They went out of the town and were coming to him. And then here's the main part we want to focus on today. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, "Rabbi, eat." But he said to them, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." So the disciples said to one another, "Has anyone brought him something to eat?" Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." So ending at 34, the main part that I want to look at today is verse 31 to 34, where Jesus says that he has food that you do not know of and that his food is to do the will of God. the will of him who sent me. So we read all of it, but all of that will aid in helping us fully understand verses 31 to 34. So if we look at the first one, let's set up what the backdrop is, just kind of analyzing what we just read. First is that Jesus, it said in verse 4, it said he had to pass through Samaria. So I find it interesting. I'm sure we've heard this story. This is a very common story. We always wonder at why it says he had to pass through Samaria, and that's a pretty common thing, so I'm not trying to bring up old news, but it still is interesting, sort of in a different way. We knew he had the divine appointment with that woman. He was going there for the reason to do that. However, I think we don't think about it on the side of the Jewish person or the disciple, meaning we look at it from our perspective. Oh yeah, Jesus had to meet the Samaritan. But from the Jews' perspective, what it meant for Jesus to basically say he had to go to Samaria had a lot of different implications to Jewish people and the disciples that were with him at the time. So we don't often think about what it would have been like for the disciples' perspective for Jesus, their leader, to kind of say he had to follow through there. So number two, for the backdrop, is the Samaritans and the Jews were rivals. So that kind of goes into why the Jews and why the disciples specifically would have thought it was quite odd that Jesus was saying he had to go through Samaria. And it's commonly known, people always say, I hear it all the time, Jews don't like Samaritans. And we just kind of leave it at that. And we're like, okay, so that's why the woman at the well was cool. That's why the Good Samaritan story was cool. But there's more to it than that and I found this out while doing this, that the Samaritan and the Jewish rivalry kind of goes all the way back to even the Old Testament. Back when, the division of the Israeli nation, the Samaritans intermarried and assimilated their culture with the idolaters. So they married with idolater nations. They started adapting their culture. They're adapting their practices and basically polluting what God had given them in the first place. And, if you read through the Old Testament, you see Israel was pretty good at that. And we are too. We do the same thing. So we're not definitely exempt. But basically, the Jews had this beef and rivalry with the Samaritans because to the Jews, from the Jews' perspective, and maybe not all thought this, but from the Jews' perspective, the Samaritans were sellouts. They were people who gave in. They were people who gave into the world and let the world pollute the good thing that they had. They let the world and the idols, they basically abandoned God. And now they still believed in God, but this is kind of where the divide happened, where, when Israel tried to finally unite after they were apart, after exile, there was bad blood between them because of what the Samaritans had done with the Assyrians, who it was that invaded and exiled them. So this passage makes so much more sense when you look at that from the view of the Old Testament, that Samaritans, it isn't just they didn't like each other because they looked different or whatever. They were brothers to an extent. They were of the same line. They came from the same place, same background, similar heritage, similar beliefs. So it goes much more, and it's hundreds of years of history. So it's not just a simple, they didn't like each other culturally. It was much more. So it makes much more sense when you see why people are surprised that Jesus did that. It wasn't just, he's talking to a woman, he's talking to someone different. It's almost like if you have a relative that some kind of situation happens where they do something, or they did something, or they said something to you, and you kind of distance yourself from them because of some conflict that you have. They're your relative, they're your brother, your sister, they're of the same blood as you, but it's like, you don't really associate yourself because they did that thing. I don't know. Or it could be even a friend that maybe you had a falling out with. It's just a similar thing. It's someone who has a similar background. They came from the same place and at one time were the same. But because of the failure, now the Jews sort of almost looked down on them. They became pagan, and the bitterness and the divide grew between them. So the Jews, for the most part, pushed the Samaritans out of culture, and Samaria was its whole separate region. So they did not even really bother with going to that area. So I would imagine that if a normal Jew were traveling from Judea to Galilee, they would go around Samaria, or they wouldn't cut through Samaria, because it made the specific point to say he had to go there, as if it wasn't a normal thing. So in their mind, in the Jewish mind, and I'm sure the disciples' mind, they were thinking, what on earth is God doing, or Jesus doing, to these people who completely lived in an opposite way from us? It wasn't accepted to do it. So 3 of the backdrop is, we got 2 was that the Samaritans and the Jews are not friends. 1 was that Jesus had to go see the Samaria. So point 3, or for the backdrop, is Jesus was weary from his journey. It says in verse 6, Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. So 6th hour is basically noon. So Jesus is coming to the well, probably traveling all morning and maybe even some of the night. And it's the heat of the day. And it says he was weary. So, I mean, sure, you can imagine if you're working on no food and you're walking and you walked miles, because, that's how they did it back then. It's a very important detail, even though it's a small detail, that Jesus was weary and that Jesus was tired, because it's one of those things that builds into the point. So he was tired, he was weary. That's the number 3 of the backdrop. Number 4, for the setting up of the context, was Jesus was hungry. And it says, well, it doesn't specifically say, but you can imply it from in verse 8, where it says his disciples had gone away into town to buy food. So you can imagine they traveled some of the night and all morning. It's really hot and it's break time. So they're going to get food. They're hungry. Jesus is probably hungry. He's tired. He's probably exhausted because, living in Florida, the heat can definitely drain you of your energy. That is for sure. So it's no different there. So Jesus was hungry. The disciples were going to get food. It's noon. Anyone would be hungry. Sometimes I get hungry every 2 hours and all I do is sit on my couch and do nothing. So you can imagine Jesus walking for hours was hungry, as were the disciples. So another small detail, but important. And then number 5 for the backdrop is Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well, and she believes, or she converts, or she believes in Jesus. So these are basically the 5 summary points of the backdrop of what we just read, just to kind of set the tone for what we are going to be looking at. So go back to verse 31 to 34, and we will be looking at that. Again, I'll read it one more time. Meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him something to eat? Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. So after reading that, we pick up. Jesus came back from, the woman of the well, or they came back from getting their food, whatever. And once again, you have to imagine he still hasn't eaten. He still, hasn't rested as far as we know. And he didn't get the drink of water that he asked for at the well, as far as we know. And we pick up to the disciples urging Jesus to eat. It didn't just say asked him to eat, didn't say they should. It said urging. And something to notice when you look at verse 30 is after the Samaritan woman went and told everyone, she said, come see this man who told me all I ever did. It says they went out of the town and were coming to him. So we see in verse 30 that people were coming to Jesus, meaning physically, like they were coming to where Jesus was because they had heard the story of what happened and what had happened to the Samaritan woman. So even after the normal break, after being hungry, after the disciples came, even more people were coming to him. So he didn't even get a break after being tired all that long. And Jesus's life, when you look at him in the Bible, is constantly filled with him giving up his break to serve other people. What would have been a normal time to be like, okay, that's normal, have a break. We would do that all the time. He constantly gave himself, no matter what, people, thousands of people. He never had a quiet moment, almost, it seems like. And that's something it points to the desperate need that we so overlook, that there is a lost crowd of people, and that Jesus looked at with compassion. We should look at with compassion and see them and say, we need to reach them. And we need to be desperate enough that we're willing to give up what we feel like we need for the crowd. And that's what Jesus did. And if the crowd came to find Jesus in Samaria, why doesn't the crowd come find us? And I know we're not Jesus. I know we're not doing miracles. But if we're supposed to be a light and an example and a reflection of what Jesus is, then where's the crowd? And where are we putting ourselves where we can see the crowd? And 2, Jesus was focused giving so much on giving on himself that he didn't consider his own comforts. And I always love if you're reading in the New Testament, I think it's around Luke, Jesus goes out in the evening to pray. He had a tiring day of ministry. He goes out to pray, quiet moment with God, to refill, to say, okay, I'm just going to take a few moments. Sometimes we need moments alone. Even Jesus had moments alone with him and God. But it says, if you read that, as he was praying, he was approached by a crowd that interrupted his prayer. Like, I guess he stole a moment away, and then somehow the crowds came back to him and they found him. And so he didn't even get a moment to pray. And sometimes we make the argument that we need like physical rest before we can do more. Sometimes I think, oh, I need this before I can properly do this for God. And it's just an excuse sometimes I make because in my flesh, I don't want to do some things sometimes. But Jesus was human too. He had physical limitations. He got tired. He got hungry. And he still gave up his rest. So if the timeline suggests what it seems, the disciples come up to him saying, hey, you should eat. If you just read it how it says, while people are, the crowds are coming from Samaria saying, probably wanting to see what this Jesus is all about. So I can picture, Jesus is doing whatever, talking to the crowd, whatever, and the disciples come up and, it's been a long time. And it says that they urge him to eat. And urge almost carries the idea of how when someone is mourning, sad over a lost one perhaps, and they're so in a state of mourning that they don't want to eat, it isn't until their loved ones come along and almost say, hey, you have to eat because this isn't good for you. This is going to end up bad. You have to eat something. I know you don't feel like it. It's almost like, that imperative almost making them eat. So when he says that they urged him to eat, it almost carries that idea that they were doing it because, imagine Jesus is probably getting pretty far along, running on fumes. And mind you, Jesus wasn't just avoiding food by saying, my food is to do the will of God, but we'll get there. So that brings up first point, main point number one, is that doing the will of God is what filled Jesus. So when Jesus said in verse 32 or 34 rather, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Jesus was saying that he gained life and satisfaction from doing the will of God, which was to see the lost saved. So in a sense, we know that food is essential for basically what food is essential for is what Jesus is saying. Food is essential. We need food, for strength. We need it to, we need eat 3 times a day, sometimes more. Food is something that we need for life, for strength, for sustenance, to fuel our body. And Jesus was saying basically what real food is to the person is what the will of God is to me. It is the food that gives me strength. It is the food that fills me, sustains me. It keeps me going. It gives me the fuel that I need. So Jesus was saying, I don't fill up on I don't fill up on physical food, which obviously he eats. He's not just saying no food for no purpose. It's not about the food. He's saying what fills him and keeps him going when he's weak and tired is doing the will of God and is seeing the lost be saved. And if you think about going without food, even for a few hours, when you go without food, it's kind of all that you think about. If a few hours goes by, let's say you don't eat breakfast and it's around 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, you start thinking, man, I'm hungry. And then a little more time goes by. And then the next thing you're thinking about is, okay, you're going to only think about when you can eat. And then when you eat, you're good. It's like it dominates our mind when we're hungry until we eat. I'm sure even during the service, I've found myself thinking about what's going to be for lunch. And I'm sure we all do that sometimes. And so it's any meeting, whenever we feel that pang of hunger, the worse it gets, the more it dominates our mind. And so the next thing we try to do is eat if possible. So especially after you work in the heat like Jesus did, you're drained and you are probably getting dizzy, possibly lightheaded. And Jesus was this hungry and more. And he was saying, my food is to do the will of God. So you can imagine how hungry he probably was and how any of us would be like, oh, yes, food. That's the next thing I'm thinking about. But yeah, that's what the disciples were thinking about. They're saying eat. They went into town directly to get food. But Jesus was so hungry, yet still thinking my food is to do the will of God. My fulfillment, what keeps me going is the will of God and seeing the lost saved. Even when I'm tired, even when I'm weak, that's not an excuse for me. And it strengthened him and it filled him when he was weary. It kept him going. And he was thinking of his purpose, not his hunger. And I think a lot of times, whether it be physical things or meaning whether it be food or any other thing in the world, we often confuse our hunger for the purpose that we have. we have this hunger and we just want to fill up on whatever it is that is out there, whatever it is that we can get to fulfill whatever this desire is that we have. But Jesus was focused not on the hunger, but on the purpose. And if we're focused on our purpose, the hunger fades. That's kind of the thing. It's like when, it says the verse, I think it says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. It's not that you just get whatever you want. It's that when your desires are God's, and we know this, that, it always happens. And it's like when your desires are God's, the desire for sin and everything else fades away. And so Jesus's desire was so much to see lost people saved that the physical hunger wasn't even on his mind. And he was saying his craving satisfaction was the will of God. He didn't live for food, and his work allowed him strength to keep going when he was tired and hungry. And, we even think we need rest, we need food, and that's true. It's biblical to rest, of course. God rested the seventh day. He was setting the tone. Back in the old times, Israel had to rest their land every 6 years, I think. On the seventh year, they rested. And then the year of Jubilee, I think it was every 49 years, they rested the 50, if I'm not wrong. But it was something like that. And so rest is good. But Jesus was saying here, because it would have been a normal thing to rest. He's saying my rest and my food is to do the will of God. That is what I'm here for. And midday, which is what did it say? The 6th hour, that's noon. Culturally, that was a normal time for people to take a break from hearing legal cases, from farming, from tending to animals, from working, whatever it was. That was a normal time for people. That was just like the break. I guess it was a cultural thing. Everyone's off at this time. Kind of like the generic term is the 9 to 5, even though a lot of people don't work that. It's like, oh, everyone's heading home from work at 5, 6 o'clock. It's like everyone would be taking a break at this point. So when it's noon, Jesus is coming to the well and he's going to get the water. This is like the almost prescribed break time. And it would have been normal for him to take a break, and it would have been fine for him to take a break. It would have been what everyone else would do. But he was so focused on God that the physical was not his priority. He was powered by something else. And he wasn't living on bread alone, as we heard the verse earlier, but every word that comes from God. He was living on that, and he was being strengthened by that. And he was so in love with us that his fulfillment came from loving others and saving others and seeing that lost woman be saved. His love is so deep that it motivated him and pushed him past the hunger. And just think about how much love that is to have for someone, that you are satisfied most by giving to yourself the least. Like, that's such a hard concept to wrap our minds around, that you're the most satisfied and the most at peace and at joy when other people are getting more and you are getting less. That's such a hard thing, because even when we're eating, we try to get, the most that we can eat. Or when we're doing anything, we try to get the most we can. We get the largest size, the biggest this, the most this. But Jesus had it the other way, where him getting the least and others getting the most is what gave him satisfaction. And it reminds you and me of the verse, for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame, and now is seated at the right hand of God. Jesus suffered. So for the joy set before him, he suffered, because the joy was seeing lost get saved. So it's the same with the scenario at the woman at the well. His love is so much that the joy set before him helped him endure the hunger. The joy of seeing all those crowds of people coming up to him be saved, that is the joy set before him that helped him endure the pain and the tiredness of hunger. Hunger felt small to him compared to the big love he had. And that kind of continues. Jesus's love fueled him, is even when he was weak, is the next thing. And just looking at passages, and I don't know, it's hard to explain this mindset, but we have this mindset when we look at passages that, like this, where Jesus does something really cool for someone, that he just does that because he's God. He's an all-powerful God, so he can do miracles because this and that. He's God, so that's what he does. We just read the Bible. That's God. That's what he does. But we often sometimes forget to highlight the fact that he did everything because of just the deep love he had for lost people, the love that was willing to transcend through, years and years and years of dark history to say, I'm going to go past this because this person is in need. So loving, just imagine how happy and ecstatic Jesus probably was to see that lost person be saved. We often just think God did it, but that was another person transferring from dark to light. And Jesus, the most loving person, even more loving than us, much more. Imagine how joyful he was. It doesn't say it specifically, but how happy he would have been to see that. So Jesus being happy to see that is probably what fueled him to keep going when he was hungry, what fueled him to keep going when the crowds were coming, because to him, seeing them saved was much more important than his own physical comfort. And he longed for her soul. And a lot of times we don't even have the excitement, like, and this is obviously bad, and it comes from a spiritual mindset that isn't always good. And this is why we need to renew our mind with God. But there are times where, you know, you're at a church service perhaps, and you hear the speaker telling about all the people that just got saved. And, you know, they're going through the names or whatever. And you're like, oh, you know, last week at our service, we had 5 people get saved. And, you know, we do like a little clap because, you know, yay, people get saved. But like, how do we actually, are we actually that excited? And we should be. Do we have so much love for other people that even if their salvation doesn't affect us personally, it means everything to us because it's another person that was lost that's going to heaven? And I just wonder, where is our urgency sometimes? And where is our love and excitement that is so deep that when people aren't saved, it hurts. And when people are saved, it is so happy, because even, you know, it says the heavens rejoice when one person accepts God. And, you know, we want God to long for our soul, but we so often don't want us to long for other people's souls. You know, we're happy that God, we always say, you know, God loves us, God cares so much about us, but we don't think about how we should be extending that love to other people, because Jesus definitely taught to keep the mindset off of ourselves and onto him. And the interesting thing that I like to think about as far as the food concept goes, when you think about, let's say, a dessert of some kind and you eat it, it kind of, I guess, takes away your appetite. You know, you eat, let's say, cheesecake. Cheesecake is pretty rich and sweet. Maybe you don't like it, maybe you do. But you eat a piece of cheesecake, after you eat it, you're done because it's rich, it's sweet. You're like, okay, you know, that kind of satiated my appetite. I don't need any more. You know, I don't need to eat any more food. It filled me because that was sweet enough to, it just, you know, it kind of takes the food curve away. And for Jesus, seeing a lost person get saved was the same thing for him. It was sweet. It was what satiated his appetite. It was what filled him. It was sweet to him. And after that, he didn't need food. He said, this person got saved. That is sweet to me. I don't need any of this other food. And I think sometimes we just, you know, we see these stories of Jesus, and we see, you know, we should act like Jesus because he was kind or he turned the other cheek. But in every single thing that Jesus did, we are called to be like Christ. And so every single little thing, even just his urgency to love the lost, even his joy over finding someone who is lost get saved, that is something we need to have. And imagine how we would be if more than anything, it was important to us and it filled us and it made us not need anything else, just seeing someone else get saved. That's so contrary to the world. You know, we think whatever it is that can get more for us, whatever it is that can make us more comfortable, our first instinct when something happens is think of how we would react or what we would do. If disaster happened, we think, what would we do first? And all of that, what would we do for ourselves? And, you know, Jesus is saying, I'm not thinking about the food, I'm thinking about seeing them get saved. And I just wonder what would happen if we were so dedicated to that we would do the same. Jesus sacrificed rest for the lost is what is next. So like I was saying, going back to the 6th hour, that is that was the normal time to be taking a break from whatever it was. But Jesus, it would have been acceptable for him. But Jesus said that the harvest of lost souls is the exception for me. The harvest is the exception to this general rule of rest. Everyone would be like, oh yeah, rest, whatever you're doing, you're working hard. But the exception to that for Christ was the lost. He didn't let that become a reason to stop preaching the gospel. And how many times do we let much less get in the way? You know, we let so much less get in the way of the urgency of the harvest. And when Jesus, he fasted for 40 days, right, in a different part of the Bible. And that was a spiritual thing he was doing. It wasn't just like he didn't have food, obviously. It was a spiritual thing he was doing. And, that you can imagine what I can't imagine what it would be like after 40 days of not eating. But he still stuck through with it because his goal and why he came was more important than the discomfort he may have been feeling. Like it said, man does not live by bread alone. And so we let much less than stuff like severe physical discomfort get in the way. And Jesus didn't let physical weakness become a reason for stopping. He didn't let his rest or his physical state determine that. And so many times in our life, our food and our drink and our comfort, our money is TV, friends, but Jesus' source of life was the harvest, and nothing else would fill him because his life was meant for that. And we rely so often on physical means to propel our spiritual life. You know, we say that the state of our physical being, whether it be sickness, whether it be health, whether it be hunger, whether it be tiredness, whether it be, whatever, we almost determine what we can do spiritually on how we are physically. Like, oh, if I'm super tired, I guess I have to rest before I can do anything else. Or if I'm sick, I can't serve God. I'm sick. That's what I'm doing at the moment. Or if I'm really hungry, okay, it's not healthy for me to do this, so I should eat before I serve God, because otherwise, if I'm hungry, I can't serve God the best way that I should. And we kind of give ourselves those excuses. But God went even further to say that my spiritual work is what propels my physical body, not the other way around. We do it the other way around. We say my physical body propels my spiritual work. But Jesus said, no, even more, my desire to do spiritual work is not going to be hindered by anything. It's actually going to push my body to go further than I normally could, because I have that much passion and that much care for it. And he depended on his love and joy to keep him going, to fill when even, his body couldn't go anymore, even when, you can't rely on your physical state. And, we act as if there comes a point where we are too tired or too hungry or too uncomfortable to actually do that. And there are times where it's like, I'll even make this excuse. This is just coming from where I am sometimes, and it's obviously wrong. But there are times where, let's say I know I should spend time reading the Bible or praying before bed, but I had a long day and I'm tired. And so it's like, let's say it's pretty late and I have to wake up early. It's like, well, I should get, the healthy, normal amount of hours of sleep, right? Because if I don't get the number of hours of sleep, I'm not functioning properly, and then I can't do my day properly, and then that's not good. So I might as well, just go sleep, because I feel really tired and I need the proper amount of hours of sleep. But there are many nights where Jesus was up all night praying until the early morning. And, we can't even say we want to spend a few minutes reading the Bible before bed because we had a long day and we're tired. And those are just some type of things that I come up with, and maybe you guys can relate. And it's even other things, like, it doesn't have to be only that. It's like, if we just had a long day and you don't want to spend time with God. Jesus had many long days. His entire life was long days, and he didn't let that. He spent every waking moment thinking about other people, not ourselves. So it's just a matter of not letting excuses of where we are physically. Because, Paul, I honestly think about this sometimes. I would have a hard time staying focused on God if I was in severe physical pain. Like, it would, I don't know, because I've, physical pain, serious physical pain. I don't know what that limit is, but imagine Paul or any other person, even Christ, for instance, who was suffering on the cross, severe physical pain. Like, it would just, if I was in such pain, I feel like it would just dominate what I thought about, and it would make it almost hard to focus on anything else because the pain was so much greater. But Jesus, who literally suffered the worst thing you could even imagine, still, he was perfect. He still had his focus on other people. He still had his focus on God, and still had his focus on his mission. And I think sometimes, we feel like we have to be comfortable to be able to serve God properly. But sometimes, a lot of times, and I mean physically comfortable. Of course, it's never going to be really socially comfortable to serve God fully. But even Paul and all those people in the old times, they went through a lot of physical pain, beatings. I'm sure that probably brought sometimes infection and soreness and sickness. I'm sure cold nights in a prison cell. And that did not stop them at all from drawing closer to God. In fact, it drew them closer. And I just think sometimes, especially in our society, we're so privileged, and we can let where we are physically determine where we are spiritually as well. And it's like, we can't focus. It's like, oh, well, I'm in severe pain, or I'm severely tired, or I'm severely hungry. It's okay to not think about God right now. Or no one should expect me to, because physically I'm unable. But Jesus did a lot of things that he shouldn't physically been able to do, but it's because he had the passion and the love to do it. And that's what my point is, that we need to let what our purpose is fuel everything else. And we can do a lot more things like going the extra mile. So even when it came to determining this sermon or what God spoke to me, I was sitting in the Bible study. Yeah, as we know, we did like the month of prayer and fasting. I think it was last month, January, yeah. And so we were doing that, and I had chosen to do it the Wednesday, which was the Bible study day, which was the day they did this. And near the end of Wednesday, we fast to really dedicate time to hear answers from God, to say, okay, God, I can't do this on my own. I want to hear from you. And I'm just asking that you would show me yourself. And that's kind of the whole main gist behind fasting. And so I was Wednesday because, asking God of things. And what happened was, it was around Wednesday night, and I was thinking, about possibly fasting a second day because, going the extra mile to say, God, even more than food, I want to hear from you and I want to do your will. And so I was thinking that, but I was like, do I really want to do that? I did one day. That's good enough, right? I mean, I did one day. That's more than what it would normally be for anyone else. So, I mean, why not? I think one day is good. And plus I like to eat. So I'd rather just do it one day, and I still did it. But then it was that day, while I was contemplating all of that, we went through the Bible study, and Jesus said, my food is to do the will of God. And I have food that you don't know about, and it's to accomplish his work and his will. And to me, that just hit me as, more than food. And even though it would have been acceptable, okay, eat the next day. That's fine. Who cares? But that just hit me as God was focused on more than food. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. He was focused on more than that. And his desire was the will of God. So if I'm so bent up on wanting to only fast one day because I just feel like I don't want to be uncomfortable anymore, then I'm basically saying that my focus isn't on the will of God, and it's on my physical comfort. And hearing that made me think, man, how I want to have the love of God so much that what fills me and keeps me going, even when I am hungry, is the desire to do his work. And so it just spoke to me, because sometimes we can face this desire to kind of fade back. And like, that's what I was doing, fade back, do the thing that is good, but not the thing that's great. And going the extra mile is where a lot happens. But just seeing that the food is what propelled every time that I would think about it, every time I'd be like, maybe I should only fast one day. And then I'd be reminded of that. Or every time I got hungry, I'd be reminded, my food is to do the will of God. And what I'm asking of God is much more important than eating. It's going to be gone in a few hours again anyways. And just another example of serving, even in physical pain, was Job. It said he never denounced God or anything. He questioned God for sure. And he wondered what was happening. But Job was in some of the worst physical pain for quite a long time. And he still was a follower of God. And that is definitely no different for us. So next is, Jesus chose living water himself. So Jesus, in a sense, chose living water. And, Jesus is the living water. So it sounds a little odd. But when you look at what he did with the Samaritan woman, giving her the option of living water that you'll never thirst from again, the physical water or living water, he, in a sense, chose living water or chose living food. It sounds odd, but instead of looking for food where he will eat and be hungry again, where he'll eat and then dispose of it in a few hours, he was feeding on the food of the will of God. So, and I like to just picture, he said to the woman at the well, you'll drink of this water and you'll be thirsty again. And I like to think, Jesus, after he was done, he was hungry, I'll eat of this food, but I'll have to eat again. But he, in his mind, spiritually was, I'm going to feed on the will of God and the food of the will of God to keep me going, because that is what gives purpose. And so I just like the parallel. The physical water and physical food are both used, but so is spiritual water and spiritual food. And the parallel is that they are both things that we view as necessary for life, but Jesus' point that there is more. And just as you see in one of the verses, it says that she ran off without her pot, the very thing that she came there for, the very thing that in midday you need, thirsty. She ran off without her pot because she found what was better, and what she now had was more important than just oh, water, I can come get that anytime. If I drink that, I'll be thirsty again. But this is what lasts forever. And Jesus, in the same way, left food behind because what he had was better than food. So 2 is Jesus had his mind on things above, and disciples had their minds on things on earth. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, how the disciples would have been quite shocked that Jesus was saying that he had to go through Samaria. And when you look at it, after the food and drink is the will of God, you realize he had to go through Samaria because the spiritual food of the will of God was there. And so he was going there because that is where the lost were being saved, and that is the will of God. So imagine, what it was like for the disciples, basically saying, I have to go through the territory of our religious rivals and cultural rivals, the people that we pretty much ignore and avoid. I'm going to make an intentional point to go there. And in their mind, he knew, but in any Jew's mind, they'd be like, no, we don't need to go see them. They held on to the fact that they looked down on them, and they were these people who abandoned it, and they were bitter towards one another. And the Jews and the disciples' mind, the Samaritans weren't a part of their mission. And I can even imagine the disciples thinking, yeah, we're here changing the world with Jesus, but in their mind, I can imagine the cultural thing still getting in the way. And in their mind thinking, oh yeah, but the Samaritans, no, they're not a part of that. But, they were a part of God's mission. And the significance is that going through all of the social and cultural problems and the division and the discrimination that was there, Jesus said, more important than law or religion, I am going to love someone who is seeking and who is open, even if it means they're in a different place. And that's the point we hit on most of the time, that, Jesus reached someone who was normally not talked to, which is definitely the point. But Jesus was there, and it was a huge deal that he was going through and that he was sharing the gospel with them, because his food. See, when the disciples were saying, as I said, the point of this is the disciples had their minds on things on earth, God had it on above. So in the same way, they had their mind on the physical food. Like, they're like, Jesus, you need to eat. But Jesus was like, I have better things than that. And their mind was on the physical, in the sense that, as it said, they marveled that he was talking. No one asked, why are you talking with this person? But they thought it. And so they were looking at the physical, both in the actual food, but they were looking at the physical in that they didn't see the Samaritans as people they needed to reach for the gospel. They were looking at the physical, which was the history, which was they're different than us, which was they're sinful, which was we don't associate with them culturally. That is the physical. And they were saying, okay, well, they're not a part of our mission. But Jesus had his mind on things above, which was, regardless of what you see physically, regardless of what's in front of you, about the history, about the past, spiritually, they are lost and they are needed. And that is like the difference. So many times you see the disciples thinking, do you remember that one where Jesus was like, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees? And they're like, what is he talking about? Bread? Did someone forget bread? And then he's like, no, like they just missed the point. And so many times the disciples had their minds on things on earth when it's so much bigger than that. They had their minds on the division between them and between the Samaritans, but Jesus had his mind on reaching them regardless of where, and forgiveness. And, when you read it, you see that the disciples went off to get food and they come back and they had little effect. They didn't have crowds following them. And that's probably because they were get in, get out. We don't associate them. We don't reach them. They're something else. But Christ prioritized the lost over the predetermined views of what the Jews held against the Samaritans. And he sought to save when even the disciples wouldn't. And he brought a whole town to himself doing that. And the disciples came back by themselves. So you can just kind of picture that. And it's a picture for us. Like I was saying, why doesn't the crowd come to us? And obviously we're not Jesus, and obviously that sounds weird. But my point of it is, the disciples, had they been seeking to reach the lost and look past the physical, then perhaps they could have had people that were like, wow, what is this they're preaching? They're preaching something different. But rather than that, or instead of that, they were looking at the physical and weren't caring. And so for us, sometimes we can get loaded on the physical, meaning it could be things that we're trying to do to fill ourselves, or it could be judgments on other people or things that we view other people as. And that's really hindering us from reaching the most people. Whereas if the disciples had gone into and stopped looking at the physical and just saw the harvest and saw the will of God, they could have reached so many more people, I believe. And that's why you see Jesus, his mind wasn't on food, it was on things above. It wasn't on the Samaritan division, it was on reaching them, and he brought the whole town to himself through that. And so that's a transition into basically the application of where is our food? Where is your food? Where do you find your food? You know, even in a state where Jesus was weak, he was moved by God and motivated by God. And how many of us can say the same thing, that we are motivated by the food of the will of God? Because many times, you know, what is it that makes you get up every day? Sometimes I get up, you know, I just do, you go to work, you do your errands, you do your chores, you do your things that you have to do because, oh, this is life. This is the task that I have to do. But so many times I find myself just living days and days where I just carry on doing these things that are life that don't seem bad, but they're really, how often am I evangelizing? How often do I reach someone for the gospel? How often are those things that are eternal things? Or how often are they sometimes things that are going to pass away? So every time, and it's a matter of us saying we need God, and it has to be what keeps us going. Because when all else fails, God lasts. You know, the verse says in Matthew that, you know, store up for yourself treasures in heaven, because, you know, in heaven, moth and rust doesn't destroy. Thieves don't break in and steal, but on earth they do. And so many times we build up these things that we're trying to achieve and trying to get and trying to use to make ourselves feel better and to fulfill us. But the problem is that they're all going to pass away. You know, how much of this can we take with us when we die? None of it. But the thing we can take is those we reach, because we'll see them again. And those things last forever. So Jesus is saying he keeps his mind on things above. He is not laying up for himself treasures in heaven. Not on earth. He is focusing on eternal and laying up treasures in heaven. You know, he wasn't thinking about the food, which, like I said, would be expelled in 5 hours. He wasn't thinking about the division, which would have said, hey, don't talk to the Samaritans. He was thinking about things that would last forever, because 100 years from now, 200 years, 300 years from that time, maybe the division with Samaria would be gone, and food, it's going to be gone. Everything's going to pass, but Jesus said, all that's going to go away. So I'm going to lay up myself treasures in heaven. And that treasure was the soul of the woman. And the treasure for us is the same. It's the souls of people. And so God is saying, don't lay up for yourself things that aren't the souls of people. So that's a good question to ask. How many things in our life are we laying up on earth that are not the souls of people? Because the amount of times I evangelize compared to how many times I do other things, or how many times I think of other things, it's a pretty big difference. Because so many times I'm thinking of things that are going to pass away, when the souls is what lasts forever. And that should be what we spend most of our time on. So what is stopping us from laying up treasures of heaven? I think sometimes it is filling up on the wrong food. Like we said, physical food is what Jesus was saying was not his fuel. It was God that was his fuel. And like I was saying, we can fill up on food, friends, family, money, TV, media, all of these things we can fill up on. But in the end of the day, like one of my favorite verses I always say is, to live is Christ and to die is gain. Nothing more is our life to be used for than God. And so what is it in our life that we are filling up on? What is it that we're using as is food in the Bible? Strength. What are we using for motivation? What are we using to push us? What are we using to fill us? What are we using to make us happy? Because a lot of times it isn't God. And like it said here, if you keep coming back to the water, eventually you'll have to keep drinking. But if you have living water, then you do not have to drink. He said, drink, you'll never be thirsty. Maybe you are today thirsty for the living water, and the musicians can come back up now for invitation as we close out. But maybe today you are thirsty for living water, and maybe you are a Christian and you have the living water, but you are looking for living food, and you keep finding food in the physical things of this world. You only keep getting more thirsty, and you will only keep having to come back to the well of physical water if you keep trying to fill up on the things that do not last. And like it said, when she left the water, she left the water she had came for, like we said, because she had found something better. She had found something, she knew that would make her have to come back. It wouldn't fill her. It would fill her for a time. And that's how the world is. The things we have fill us for a time, but they don't fill us forever. And that is why she left her pot, because she found something that could fill her forever. And Jesus said the same with food. So you may be here, and in your mind, you either may be a Christian who maybe for the most part just kind of lives life filling up on food that is not spiritual food, physical foods of the world. It could be career, it could be anything. But anything that is not laying up treasures in heaven, he who knows good to do but does it not, it is sin. And so when we know that we should be spreading the gospel and laying up treasures in heaven and we're not doing it, it's pretty clear what the Bible says about that. And so perhaps either you're a Christian and maybe you're living with food that is physical and trying to fill yourself up. Now and today and always, God opens the door, is a time to say, I'm going to commit to having food that is not of this world. I'm going to commit to having food that is doing the will of God. And that is what Jesus was filled. That is what kept him going. And that is what keeps us going when we're weak, when we're tired, when we're scared, when we're sad, when we're fearful, when we're emotional, when we're anxious and depressed. The food of the will of God is what can fill us and keep us going and give us strength, just like real food. And maybe you aren't saved, and maybe you're like the Samaritan woman who came to the well and said, what is this living water you're talking about? How is there water that I can get that I never have to come back for? I don't understand that. And maybe you've been like the woman in the Samaritan story. She had 5 husbands before, and she was on her 6th, and that person wasn't even her husband. She was filling up on all these things, that she thought would make her happy. Oh, love will make me happy. A husband will make me happy. But first one didn't work, went to the second one. Second one didn't work. And, 5, 6 later, she realizes this is not working, because eventually I'll just have another one or another one. And I have to keep coming back to this husband. I have to keep coming back to something that doesn't satisfy. And she was trying to make herself live and be happy on things that wouldn't last. And so she came to the well, and God said, I can give you something that you don't have to keep coming back to. I can give you something that can satisfy you forever. And when she found that, she left her pot behind. She left the thing that she had thought she needed. She left the thing she thought would fill her up forever because she had found something better. And she left that, that water was representative of her life and trying to fill up on things that did not satisfy. When she finally found something that did, she left behind what wouldn't satisfy. And so maybe either you're in need of the spiritual food instead of the physical food, or maybe you're in need of the living water and you've never made that decision. God says in his word, if you confess with your heart and believe, or confess with your mouth and believe in your heart, you will be saved. And that is the living water. And that is what Jesus said, come take a drink of the living water, because that is what you'll never have to come back for. Everything else, it works for a while, but it only leaves you more thirsty and more empty and more weary. We think it works, but it doesn't. So now, while the music plays and while the song goes on, you can make a decision, either come forward and ask for prayer, come forward and make a decision, or you can make the decision in your seat between you and God.